So today I want to sit down with you and talk about something that is genuinely one of the most significant things that has happened in our lifetime. And I don't say that lightly. I know every week there is a new headline, a new crisis, a new thing that is supposed to be the biggest story in the world. But this one is actually different, because what is happening right now between the United States and Iran is not just a war between two governments. It is not just a military conflict somewhere far away that does not affect you. This story affects every single person on this planet. The price you pay for food, the price you pay for gas, whether flights get canceled, whether your heating bill goes up, all of it is connected to what is happening in a narrow stretch of water in the Persian Gulf right now. And I want to make sure you understand exactly what is going on, because the full story is so much bigger and so much more important than what most people are seeing in the headlines. So let me take you back, not to April, not to March. Let me take you all the way back to where this really begins, because you cannot understand the naval blockade. You cannot understand Trump's demands. You cannot understand what Iran is doing unless you understand how we got here. For years, and I mean years, the United States and Iran have been circling each other over one thing: Iran's nuclear program. The United States said Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Iran said it has the right to enrich uranium for peaceful purposes. That disagreement was never truly resolved. There was the 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA, but Trump pulled out of it in his first term. There were sanctions, there were threats, there were limited strikes. There was always this tension, always this low boil, always this sense that one day it would explode into something real. And in late December 2025, something happened inside Iran that changed everything. Nationwide anti-government protests erupted across Iran, driven by economic collapse and years of government abuse. 5 million Iranians took to the streets across more than 100 cities. It became the largest protest movement since the Iranian Revolution of 1979. People were done. They were done with the economy being destroyed by sanctions, done with corruption, done with a government that cared more about funding proxy armies across the Middle East than feeding its own people. And what did the Iranian government do? Iranian security forces massacred an estimated 30,000 civilians in the January 2026 crackdown. 30,000 people killed for protesting. And that is when Trump made his decision. Now, there were negotiations happening at the same time. The US and Iran were talking indirectly about a nuclear deal. They met in Oman in February. They met in Rome. They met in Geneva. But the gap between the two sides was enormous. Washington demanded the full dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program. Tehran insisted enrichment was non-negotiable. Trump said publicly, very clearly, "I say no enrichment. Not 20%, 30%, no enrichment." And Iran's foreign minister said equally publicly that Iran has every right to enrich uranium and it is not going to give that up. Two positions, completely opposite, no middle ground anywhere in sight. And then, during the second round of nuclear talks in Geneva on February 17th, Khamenei threatened the US warships already positioned in the region. He said Iran was capable of sinking them. He said that even though the US military may be the strongest in the world, the strongest army in the world can sometimes be slapped so hard it cannot get up. Those were his last public words of defiance, because 11 days later, the war started. On February 28, 2026, at 2 a.m. Eastern Time, Trump posted an 8-minute video on Truth Social. Not a speech to Congress, not a primetime press conference, a Truth Social video at 2 in the morning. And in that video, he announced that the United States military had just begun major combat operations in Iran. He said America was doing this to defend the American people by eliminating imminent threats from the Iranian regime, and that Iran can never, ever have a nuclear weapon. US and Israeli forces launched nearly 900 strikes in just the first 12 hours of what America called Operation Epic Fury. 900 strikes in 12 hours. Think about what that number means for a second. That is a bomb or a missile hitting somewhere inside Iran every single minute for 12 straight hours. B-2 stealth bombers, B-1 bombers, B-52s, hundreds of fighter jets from multiple directions, all hitting simultaneously, targeting Iran's nuclear facilities, its ballistic missile infrastructure, its air defense systems, its military command centers, all at once. And then came the news that genuinely shocked the world. Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, the man who had ruled Iran with an iron fist since 1989, the man who was the symbol, the face, the soul of the Islamic Republic, was killed in the very first wave of strikes, gone on the first night. Along with him, Iran's defense minister, the IRGC commander, the Defense Council secretary, and 4 top Ministry of Intelligence officials were all killed. The entire top leadership of Iran's military and security structure wiped out in one night. The Iranian government declared 40 days of mourning, but Iran did not collapse, and that is the thing people need to really understand. Iran fought back hard. Iran launched sustained waves of ballistic missiles and drones targeting Israeli population centers and U.S. military positions across the entire region. At the height of the initial barrage, roughly 80 missiles were fired on the first day, followed by about 60 the next day, and around 30 on the third. And it did not stop there. Iran expanded its attacks across the Gulf. Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, all of them were hit. Energy infrastructure, civilian areas, locations near U.S. military installations. Iran struck a hotel in Bahrain's capital, Manama, causing civilian casualties. Iranian drones hit U.S. naval facilities. Ballistic missiles struck American air bases in Qatar and Kuwait. This was not a small retaliation. This was a region-wide war that spread within hours. And then Iran played what it thought was its most powerful card. It closed the Strait of Hormuz. Now, I need you to really understand what that means. Because when you hear Strait of Hormuz, it might sound like just another geography term. But let me tell you exactly what it is. It is a narrow strip of water at its narrowest point, about 33 kilometers wide, sitting between Iran and Oman. And through this tiny, narrow corridor, roughly 20% of the world's oil and natural gas passes every single day. Saudi Arabia's oil, the UAE's oil, Kuwait's oil, Iraq's oil, Qatar's gas, all of it has to travel through this one narrow passage to reach the rest of the world. Before this war, more than 100 tankers were making that crossing every single day. Iran shut it all down. The closure cut daily oil throughput from 20 million barrels all the way down to just 3.8 million barrels per day. An 81% collapse affecting 1/5 of global petroleum supply. 81%. Think about what that number means in real life. You take away 81% of supply from one of the world's most critical oil passages, and the entire global economy starts shaking within hours. Oil prices surged from about $72 a barrel on February 28th all the way up to $128 on a single day in April. A 55% monthly gain in March, the largest monthly oil price increase in recorded history. And people were feeling this everywhere. Americans were paying over $4 for a gallon of gasoline. But this was not just about gas prices. The director of the International Energy Agency came out and told the world that Europe has maybe 6 weeks of jet fuel left. 6 weeks. He said if the Strait of Hormuz does not reopen soon, you will start hearing about flights being canceled because airlines will not have enough fuel to fly. Think about that. Not oil prices being uncomfortable, planes potentially grounded. That is how connected the whole world is to this one narrow piece of water. Major container shipping companies, Maersk, CMA CGM, Hapag-Lloyd, all suspended transits through the Strait and related routes like the Red Sea. The biggest shipping companies in the world stopped. Global supply chains, already fragile, started seizing up. Meanwhile, Operation Epic Fury kept going. After 38 days of major combat operations, U.S. Central Command reported over 10,200 air sorties flown, more than 13,000 targets struck inside Iran, and over 150 Iranian naval vessels destroyed. And the human cost: 13 American service members killed, 303 wounded, primarily from Iranian ballistic missile and drone strikes on Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia. Real Americans, with families, with lives, killed in this war. Over 2,000 Iranians killed from U.S. and Israeli strikes. More than 2,300 people killed in Lebanon in the fighting between Israel and Hezbollah, which had reopened as a front in this expanding war. By mid-April, Israeli operations had reportedly destroyed or disabled roughly 60% of Iran's ballistic missile launchers and severely degraded its missile production capacity. Iran's ability to keep launching at the same scale as the first days of the war significantly reduced. But here is the critical thing that everyone needs to understand. Iran's nuclear program survived more than 5 weeks of the most intense bombing campaign in modern history. It survived. 2 decades of diplomacy could not kill it. 5 weeks of bombing could not kill it. It is still there. After 40 days of war, both sides were exhausted. Pakistan stepped in as a mediator. Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and the Pakistani Army Chief worked around the clock to broker something, and on April 8, 2026, a ceasefire took effect. Iran would allow ships to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. would pause its bombing. Everyone would go to the negotiating table. It sounded like the beginning of a way out. But within hours of the ceasefire, it became clear that Iran had a very different understanding of what the ceasefire meant. Instead of simply reopening the strait, Iran began controlling traffic and charging tolls of over $1 million per ship. Some ships were being charged even more than that, up to $2 million in transit fees, according to an Iranian lawmaker who spoke to state media. $2 million per ship to pass through an international waterway, a waterway that international law says must remain open to free navigation, and ships that could not pay or would not pay, blocked. One retired U.S. admiral did the math on this publicly. He said if you take 100 ships a day, 365 days a year, at $2 million per ship, that is $73 billion a year, more than the entire U.S. Navy's annual shipbuilding budget. Iran was running the most expensive toll road in human history while the ceasefire was supposed to be in effect. And it was using that money to start rebuilding what 40 days of bombing had destroyed. By April 9th, there was no real sign the ceasefire was being implemented honestly. Ships were still being blocked or restricted. The CEO of Abu Dhabi National Oil Company said publicly that the strait was still not properly open, and that 230 loaded oil tankers were just sitting inside the Gulf, waiting, going nowhere. 230 full tankers, going nowhere, because Iran was playing gatekeeper. This pushed Trump to act. He sent Vice President J.D. Vance to Islamabad, Pakistan, for one final round of negotiations. Vance spent 21 hours on the ground, marathon overnight talks, back and forth, trying to find any possible common ground. And the core issue, the thing that everything kept coming back to, was Iran's nuclear program. The U.S. proposed a 20-year suspension of Iran's nuclear enrichment. Iran countered with 5 years. The U.S. said no. That gap, 15 years of disagreement over how long Iran should pause its enrichment, blew up the entire negotiation. Vance walked out and told reporters in Islamabad, "The simple question is, do we see a fundamental commitment of will for the Iranians not to develop a nuclear weapon? We have not seen that yet." He flew home on Air Force Two, and Trump went on Truth Social. "Right now we have a blockade." 5 words. And with those 5 words, the next chapter of this war began. On April 13th, the U.S. naval blockade of Iranian ports and coastal areas took effect. And let me be precise about what this blockade actually is, because there is a lot of confusion about it. According to U.S. Central Command, the blockade targets ships entering and leaving Iranian ports and coastal areas, including locations along the Arabian Gulf, Gulf of Oman, and the Arabian Sea east of the Strait of Hormuz. It does not stop all traffic through the strait. If you are a tanker from Saudi Arabia heading to Japan, nobody stops you. But if you are carrying goods to or from Iran, the U.S. Navy is stopping you. And Trump went further. He said the U.S. would also interdict any vessel in international waters that had already paid Iran a toll to cross the strait, calling those tolls illegal. This was a total economic siege. The military force deployed for this blockade is extraordinary. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, confirmed that more than 10,000 sailors, Marines, and airmen, over a dozen warships, and dozens of aircraft are carrying out the blockade. 10,000 military personnel actively deployed right now in that water. And General Kane said something from the Pentagon that I want you to hear clearly. He said, "I'd like to emphasize that the United States Joint Force remains postured and ready to resume major combat operations at literally a moment's notice." A moment's notice. The bombing can restart at any time. The ceasefire is holding, but only just. The blockade worked almost immediately. On the very first day, only 8 vessels transited the Strait. Before the war, it was over 100 per day. 8, from 100 to 8. And most of those 8 were already linked to Iran or were sanctioned vessels. The head of U.S. Central Command said publicly, U.S. forces have completely halted economic trade going in and out of Iran by sea. Some ships tried to evade the blockade. A Chinese-owned tanker went through the Strait of Hormuz and then abruptly reversed course in the Gulf of Oman, turning back toward Iran's coast. Another tanker left Iranian waters, passed through the strait, and then cut its engines and turned off its radio transponder entirely. Its location could not be independently confirmed after that. Ships were going dark, disappearing from radar, trying to hide from the most powerful navy in the world. Iran threatened to escalate further. Iran's army warned it could now block marine traffic not just in the Strait of Hormuz, but in the Persian Gulf, the Sea of Oman, and the Red Sea. Even more waterways, even more disruption. The IRGC Navy warned that any military vessel approaching the strait would be considered a ceasefire violation and would be met with a severe response. Trump fired back in his usual style, warning that any Iranian ships approaching the U.S. blockade would be eliminated. Iran's state newspapers ran cartoons of Trump drowning in the Strait of Hormuz with the headline, "Marine Bluff." They were mocking the blockade, calling it a bluff, but the ships were not moving, and the Iranian economy was suffocating. Internationally, the response was split. French President Macron announced plans for a peaceful multinational mission to restore freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. A summit was held in Paris, but Britain's Keir Starmer refused to support the U.S. military operation in Iran, and Trump publicly criticized him for it. Even America's closest allies were deeply uncomfortable with the scale of what was happening. China denied reports that it was preparing to send air defense systems to Iran, calling those reports entirely fabricated. Whether anyone believed that denial is a different question. And then, on April 17th, something unexpected happened. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi announced that the Strait of Hormuz was open to all shipping traffic for the duration of the Lebanon ceasefire. Markets reacted within minutes. Oil prices dropped 11% almost immediately. Stock markets around the world jumped. It looked, for a moment, like something was shifting. But Trump did not lift the blockade. He said the U.S. naval blockade on Iranian ports would remain in full force until such time as our transaction with Iran is 100% complete. Not partially complete, not mostly complete, 100% complete. Every single demand, every single condition fully met. Only then does the blockade end. And Iran's parliament speaker came right back at Trump. He said Iran would close the Strait of Hormuz again if the U.S. continued the naval blockade. He accused Trump of lying. He called it media warfare. He said the Iranian nation is not fooled by these tricks. So here's the situation as it stands today. Iran opened the strait with one hand and threatened to close it again with the other. The U.S. declared the strait open and kept the naval blockade in place anyway. The ceasefire is holding barely. A second round of negotiations is being discussed for this weekend, and 10,000 U.S. military personnel are floating in the Persian Gulf, ready to resume combat at a moment's notice. And underneath all of this, underneath every headline, every negotiation, every threat, the original question is still unanswered. The question that 2 decades of diplomacy could not answer. The question that 5 weeks of bombing did not resolve. The question that a naval blockade is now trying to force an answer to. Will Iran ever genuinely give up its nuclear program? Iran says it never wanted a weapon, that it only wanted peaceful nuclear energy, that a religious ruling from Khamenei himself forbade nuclear weapons. But what Western intelligence consistently found was a stockpile of highly enriched uranium with no credible civilian explanation, enough fissile material to produce multiple bombs on short notice. Iran was not technically building a bomb, but it had built every single capability needed to build one very quickly, if it chose to. That is nuclear hedging. Stay just below the line, keep every option open, and if your existence is ever truly threatened, you can cross that line in weeks. That is precisely what America was trying to stop, not just Iran having nuclear power. But Iran, having the ability to build a weapon at a moment of its choosing, without warning, without time for the world to respond, and Iran would not give that up at the negotiating table. The Islamabad talks broke down because the US proposed 20 years without nuclear enrichment. Iran said 5. That gap, 15 years, is the gap between peace and continued war right now. I want to leave you with one thing, because it is very easy to watch this story unfold through the lens of politics and strategy and geopolitics. Trump's demands, Iran's defiance, naval blockades, ceasefire timelines. But there are real human beings in the middle of all of this. Over 2,000 Iranians killed from US and Israeli strikes. 13 American service members killed, soldiers with families, with children, with people waiting for them to come home. 19 Israelis killed by Iranian missiles. More than 2,300 people killed in Lebanon. A girls' school struck near Bandar Abbas in the opening hours of the war, killing about 170 people. That happened on the first night. 170 girls gone. And beyond the direct casualties, people in Europe wondering if their flights will be canceled, people in the United States watching gas prices climb every week, people in developing countries watching food prices rise because fertilizer transited the Strait of Hormuz, because shipping costs have exploded, because a war in the Persian Gulf does not stay in the Persian Gulf. It ripples outward to every corner of the world. That is why this story matters to you, wherever you are watching this from. The blockade is real, the demands are real, the ceasefire is fragile. And the next few days, whether new negotiations happen, whether the ceasefire holds or collapses, whether Trump gets his deal or pulls the trigger on renewed combat, could determine whether this war moves toward some kind of resolution or explodes into something even the people running it cannot fully control. General Kane said it from the Pentagon, and I want you to remember these words. The United States Joint Force remains postured and ready to resume major combat operations at literally a moment's notice. A moment's notice. The ships are in the water. The bombers are ready. The diplomats are talking. And the whole world is holding its breath, waiting to see which one moves first.